Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Beauty Not Boundaries. I'm your host, Felice. Beauty Not Boundaries is where everyday women navigating real life come together to share our authentic experiences without boundaries. We do this in hopes of inspiring each other and helping each other grow. So, welcome. Today, we are getting honest about a very familiar experience for many professional women of color. It impacts our careers and our personal well being. We are getting honest about tokenism and the experience of going from pet to threat in the workplace, our careers, and our professional associations. For this discussion, we are joined by Mia Tran. Mia is an assistant professor of psychology at Springfield College in Massachusetts. Her research and practice centers on understanding leadership, organizational change, and diversity and inclusion dynamics in systems. Her background includes conducting assessments on employee engagement, organizational climate, leadership dynamics, performance evaluation systems, selection and retention, and job analysis for various organizations and industries. Notably, Mia is a co-author of an article entitled Women of Color at Mid-Career, Going from Pet to Threat. Welcome, Mia.
Thank you, Felice, for having me here. I'm happy to talk more about this important topic that I think is just not my line of professional work, but also has deep meaning to me in regards to my own identity and personal experience.
Well, we're so glad to have you. And indeed, this is really important. So let's hop right on in. Mia, despite being in the 21st century and over 50 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which contains workplace protections under Title VII, there still seems to be a great deficit and strides to be made to normalize, equalize, and advance, in all respects, women of color in leadership roles in the workplace beyond just token numbers. This includes token hires or promotions resulting from seemingly half-baked, temporary or non-committal, and underfunded diversity and inclusion programs and initiatives. Mia, can you help us understand from your perspective why we have come to this point, come so far seemingly, and still have more work to do?
So I just want to start off by saying that one of my area of research that I focus is on leadership, particularly women in leadership. So it would only be fair for me to just share some statistics first, since that, just last year in 2021, we had about 41 female CEOs. That's 8.2% that represent Fortune 500 companies. And of that, 1.2% are women of color. Now, if we fast forward to just this month in 2022 of February, that number has decreased to now 6.2% with only a representation of 31 females in Fortune 500 companies who are CEOs or presidents. And this has actually been reported by Catalyst Research. And, the numbers for some, depending on what level you look at, seems quite increasing at some at management level, some at lower level within the organizations. But if you look much closer in the Ivy League tower, and that means the leadership position, especially in the C-suite, those numbers are decreasing in terms of women and women of color representation. So the landscape is still not that progressive as we want it to be. I think the area that kind of inhibits the growth or representation of women in leadership is the work climate. and how women and women of color are navigating and negotiating these workspaces can sometimes be very exhausting psychologically and physiologically. So I think that's the part we're at right now, is understanding that workspace and how much of that is subtle forms of aggressions, or what we call them microaggressions today, and how they manifest into feelings of isolation, feelings of exclusion that we as women of color sometimes internalize it, and also impedes our success in leadership, and how we are represented in the workspace. So that's where I would say really matters for a lot of women, is that we're dealing with multiple layers of barriers that um, you know impedes our chances of advancement, and sometimes it starts at the individual, group, or even at the systemic organizational level.
That's interesting that you say that. So it seems like the reason why we aren't as far as we think we are, because people point to, oh, well, we had a first lady, a black first lady. Oh, we have a biracial, black vice president, female. People think that we've made these great strides, but as you just shared with us, the numbers in terms of those C suites, those sweet jobs, sweet spot jobs, right, in leadership, that many of us aspire to, those numbers are coming down, not going up. And it seems to be external forces as well as internal forces. So the internal forces, as I think I just heard you say, is our reaction or our response to the external forces. So sometimes, even to cope or to survive, right, to make it out of here, maybe I need to leave the organization. In Pet to Threat, you and your colleagues note that as workplace solo acts, underrepresented women are frequently perceived and treated by their superiors, colleagues, and even their subordinates as tokens. As I read it, your research finds that this is especially true for Black women. Why is that the case?
I think, one of the things I want to clarify is, how do we define tokenism first? And, in the literature, and even from my own personal experience, it is essentially preferential treatment that we receive because we are underrepresented in that particular area. And that means our occupation, our profession. And we're held to certain standards, but we're also worked against in regards to that we are not valued entirely for our expertise, maybe even our credibility, and sometimes our voice is not even heard when we're in these token positions. I think women, and women, specifically Black women in this situation, have different experience to white women. And if you're not familiar with my ethnic background, I'm a woman of color, but I identify as being Asian. So I usually share stories and even hear stories from my fellow Black female colleagues and friends that talks about their dual dilemma. And in the research, what we mean by dual dilemma is that Black women are experiencing what we call double jeopardy, that they are essentially, their experiences are essentially different than white women experience, because white women are able to tap into their white privilege. Their Black women experience are also very different compared to Black man experience, because Black men are able to tap into their male privilege. So therefore, like, Black women themselves have a unique social space compared to white women and even their male counterparts, which is Black men. And, my colleagues who were part of this initial research when I was in my doctoral studies were all Black women in academia, and I was the only one who was not. And to be honest with you, to hear their voices, to hear their stories about the experience they've had just by being a Black woman compared to me being an Asian woman, really highlight the necessity and the urgency to pay attention to these unique experiences that Black women have in the workplace. That sometimes they, I think, feelings of self-doubt, feeling of unsureness about their credibility in the workplace, that makes them have these barriers that makes it even more difficult for them to overcome, whether at their early career to even late careers.
And do you think there's a difference? You said you identify as Asian. I'm looking at you visibly. If I saw you walking down the street, you look like my Aunt Pam. I would think that you were an African American woman with who got her hair straightened. That's just what I would think, right? That's so. How do you think? In comparison to the experience that Asian women have, how is it different for Black women versus Asian women in this space?
I think, very absolutely, my phenotypes in terms of my skin color, I am commonly mistaken as being biracial. And one of them is being mixed with Black because of my brown skin tone.
Which is
And
beautiful. Can I just say that?
absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
You are gorgeous.
As much as we here try and be frank and candid and honesty, I want to be also vulnerable with everyone here that I went down my own journey of accepting my skin color, embracing my brownness, and not feeling like I need to fit the Asian model stereotype of being fair and straight hair. And, when I think about how this resonates with even Asian women who are like me, is that we are essentially viewed as exotic to the group. We are also viewed as the model minority, and how much pressure that puts on us to be outstanding performers and not just average performers. And if we're not meeting the exception rule, we are essentially failing our social group of being Asian. And that's something that I deal with in many ways. But yet I can see that we have our own different challenges of being women of color, and they're not necessarily the same.
Yeah, but nevertheless, based on very negative, I would even say, nefarious, destructive stereotypes and ideas of beauty, intellect, competence, all of the above. So you also note in your writings that early pioneers who find themselves as solos in the workplace may be perceived or treated as threats rather than professionals. Treated, not perceived, as threats rather than professionals. Can you explain what you mean by a pet?
Yeah, so to give you a little bit of background, when we did this research, we interviewed several women in academia that included Black women and white women. And our initial idea was just to capture some of their work experience in higher education. And as we were gathering the anecdotes, we start to see that there's a theme emerging that our early career Black women were talking about these experiences of being pacified, being treated childlike, and also being considered as their beloved token, right? Someone that we should protect and care for. But there are disadvantages to that types of treatment. And what they notice that through those perceptions and behaviors from their colleagues, their subordinates, that they were also silenced during that process. They struggled with finding their own identity and voice because they were assimilating essentially to the model or the identity that had been established by the group that had accepted them. So that's essentially how we define PET in our research study.
I think of this idea that I came up with, this sort of the pat on the head and a job well done, right? And it's like, as long as you give that person the pat on the head and the job well done, it's almost treating them like they're their little pet. Good job. I'll never promote you. You'll never fly. You'll never have your own. You'll never have your independence. But I'll continue to give that pat on the head and a job well done. To sort of those tokens of affection and appreciation to sort of keep us at the very bottom levels of the organization. Now, you talked about, what it means to be a pet, but can you describe some other ways that being a pet may manifest in the workplace?
Yeah, I think for me, it's still something I experience sometimes because of age is one of them, and majority of my colleagues are very at a different age group than me. And I think of it in regards to my early career of how I share ideas and those ideas get questioned quite quickly. And I have to provide more justifications of why my idea is important, that I need to become more prepared when I share an idea compared to my colleagues. And I think that's very common in the early careers, that we question our own credibility as much as they question ours. And for me, it was experience of less confidence of who I am, less confidence of who I am as a professional, to be honest with you, and whether I am a fraud. And that is the phenomenon of itself of being a pet, is that have I tricked them to pick me to be in this space with them? In reality, this is not who I am in my personal life. I am very vocal. I am very loud. I am very clear about what I want and what are my needs. But when I'm in this position of pet, I feel like all that goes out the window immediately, and I start to play the role that they established for me. And if I don't follow those rules, there's consequences to it. And am I ready? That means, am I confident enough? Am I empowered enough to go against some of those rules that have been established?
And I'm just going to digress just a little bit because I had that experience myself where I had been embraced by a wealthy woman at one point, and taken around all of her friends and socialites. And the hook that she used for them was that I was going to apply to Harvard. And, I was going to be going to Harvard Law, right? So, of course, to a bunch of, wealthy white women in this circle, that was the sort of the admittance ticket, right? That was the ticket to get in. Mm-hmm. And then I started sort of feeding into that, even though I have never really cared about going to Harvard or anything like that, right? Don't even care about that kind of stuff. But all of a sudden that became so important to me, right? And what they thought about me. And I didn't want to let them down. I want to talk in a certain way and be a certain way, because it was like I knew that they expected me to behave in a certain way, or have certain accomplishments in order to maintain my ticket into the circle, right? Even though that it wasn't a real ticket, they weren't giving me any of the benefits and privileges that they had. It was just being able to sit and watch them be in the room at the same time. So you start to sort of, especially at a young age, you're very susceptible to just starting to be a passive participant in your own pet status, right? So has your I was going to ask you, has your research found that we become an active participant? And we just talked about that. Yes. Right. But how do we perpetuate that? Has your research demonstrated that we actually perpetuate this notion of a pet ourselves as women of color?
I think so for me personally, but also our research do suggest that in regards to, we want to fulfill the needs of our group, which is essentially what they expect of us. It's just this desire to be more agreeableness. And that means, like, I want to essentially fit that mold. I want to be somebody that they're proud of, which is that show and tell. And there is essentially some advantages to that. And you think about it in regards to benefits. They think I'm their friend. I want to be their friend. They think I'm similar to them. I want to be similar to them. And because of that, we perpetuate it, because there are benefits associated with that process. And then in addition to it, we are also thinking that it will help us in the long term. That means that they'll consider us for advancement or promotions when it's time.
Eventually, they'll see my worth.
Yes, eventually they'll see my worth, my value, my effort, my sweat and tears. And maybe then I can feel more confident. Maybe then I can be equals to them, right? And sometimes that never comes into full vision for some people, and it leads to other outcomes being a pet. That
Mm-hmm.
those
Mm-hmm.
who do not play the role eventually leaves the organization, which is why we have like this leaky pipeline of women who are not highly represented in leadership. While there's
Mm-hmm.
lack of women in STEM fields, but yet the number of women of color receiving degrees, advanced degrees such as doctoral degrees in STEM fields, are still underrepresented compared to the male counterparts because
Mm-hmm.
of this chilly climate that they're experiencing. And that's the consequences specifically when we're not willing to perpetuate the pet
Right.
experience, right?
And we want to step into our own, and we start saying, listen, I'm going to be who I am, and unapologetic about it. And yes, I'm
Yes.
accomplishing all those things, but I don't have to box it in a way that's acceptable to you, right? I don't have to be accepted by you in order to have value, right? And to be worthy. So I want to now go to this idea of going from a pet to threat. Now, your work notes that at some point, many of those with a pet status eventually find themselves as not so beloved or adored anymore as they begin to be perceived by their colleagues or peers as more of a threat. What do you mean by threat?
Well, I just want to say that majority of us, when we think about our career path, we want to advance as much as we can. We want to break that glass ceiling, which is that invisible barrier for that many women and women of color experience. But the question we always never really think about often is what happened when we break that glass ceiling? What's it like there on the other side? So essentially, that's what we think about the threat is those pioneers who managed to emerge out of their pet identity, managed to break that glass ceiling and climb into a higher leadership positions that have more power, visibility, and decision making. And what's the experiences like there? And what we found in our research is that majority of these Black women told stories about how they were viewed as threats in regards to they challenge the status quo who's supposed to belong here. They challenge people's ideas of what the world is like, their own identity as well. What I mean own identity is that it challenged the people that they're engaging with own identity and how their power is being threatened. We believe that there's this myth of scarce resources, that only one person and only one group can have access to certain benefits. And that's where it becomes a territory that is more hostile than compared to being a pet. So what happened is the threat is mostly occurring for women in their mid to late career. The mistreatment is much more hostile, more overt than compared to the pet when it's very much covert, subtle, not sure what the intentions are. But here, the intentions can be also both overt and covert, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do
Mm-hmm.
we navigate that space and still manage to want to stay in that leadership position?
And is the perception of being a threat only about really challenging the status quo, or threatening to change the power dynamic in terms of numerical representation? Or are there other parts of threat that include even how a person is perceived and how they speak, how we carry ourselves, how we express ourselves? As you know, you often hear that people perceive Black women, especially Black women leaders, as being more aggressive, or having to prove something. Did your research find that as well, or?
Oh, absolutely. I think the more aggression, or in the word of the aggression, I use very loosely because majority of those anecdotes were talking about assertiveness, really, and very similar to many of their male counterparts. And when they are in leadership position, is being firm and assertiveness is considered a desirable leadership trait. But when Black women are exerting these same leadership behaviors and traits, they're viewed as violating our norms and expectations. If anything, it makes it seem as though they are hostile. In return, the group can respond back in hostility, which is very interesting in terms of the kind of reaction, right, to this type of behavior. And what it does, I like to say, we all have this view of the world, which is our mental schemas and how we think you should behave and how I should behave. And there are rules we must follow. And if we break them, there are consequences, just the law of order, essentially, that needs to be maintained in order for there to be equal, in order there to be expectations and session to like ability to predict, right? The more you are unpredictable, the less people feel like they connect to you and feel like you're not a threat to them.
Wow. Wow. You just said a lot right there. And, with people, that people feeling like they can't connect. And you're going, well, why can't you connect? Especially when it comes to female. Well, why is it that you can't connect? Like, what is it that you can't connect with? But it's that perception and receiving assertiveness as hostile aggression, decision making as, oh no, you're not including us. You're just, you're ignoring everybody else, and you're so independent and strong minded that you just ignore what everybody else wants. So, in your research and work, have you identified any actions in particular that women of color can do to take more control of our narrative and our career path when we start noticing the pet to threat signs surfacing in our professional experiences? If so, can you give us 3 action items?
Yes. Well, in our research, we listed 7 of them if you ever want to read more about it. But the top 3 that resonate with me mostly today, and I think about when I was an author, when we wrote this many years ago, I was in like my 3rd or 4th year as a doctoral student. So a lot of this didn't really mean that much to me as they are today. So the very first one is reconceptualizing and rejecting my external definition, which is do not let society define who you are. Creating a healthy identity, what it means to be you, and being very much acceptable of that, being more proud of that, and not being ashamed of it. And I think that's a journey for me, from my skin color to my hair color to how I speak. You name it, even the food I eat, how embarrassed I was to bring that to my office. Small little things that make an impact of how much I identify with who I am. And the more comfortable I become, the more I can feel as though I can address some of these issues as I'm encountering. The second one is balancing my culture and my identity. So for me, is who I am as a woman and who I am as a woman of color is something that's important to me, and they both have value. And the last third one is really tapping into a good support network that will help me navigate this space when I'm at my lowest.
Okay. And Mia, on that note, that is a perfect note to end on. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get more, if you want those other 7, you're going to have to go read the article. And again, it is entitled Women of Color at Mid-Career, Going from Pet to Threat. I thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Beauty Not Boundaries. I am your host, Felice, and for this discussion on Pet to Threat, we were joined by Professor Mia Tran. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you so much, Felice. Thank you, everyone.
Follow us at Beauty Not Boundaries. Thank you.